Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today and for staying this evening to enjoy the last in our winter term lecture series. Before I introduce the talk and tonight's speaker, I have been encouraged by Hannah and Sarah to make sure everybody knows about the ARC Social Mixer Drink Fest happening starting at 8:30, or more realistically, slightly after, I suspect, at Babs Underground at 213 South Ashley Street in downtown Ann Arbor. I know from last year's experience that this is a fun event. I encourage everyone to join current and future Taubman College architecture students kicking off the weekend with their preview weekend mixer. Before that, however, while we're still sober, welcome to the J. Robert F. Swanson Memorial Lecture. This is an annual event here at Taubman College, and it is a legacy of Michigan's preeminence in modernist design, architecture, and education. Albert Kahn, the Saarinen family, Alden Dow, Minoru Yamasaki, there's a whole family of legendary names in architecture who were based here in Southeast Michigan in the early and mid-20th century. The Cranbrook Academy of Art, auto designers like the famed Harley Earl of GM, as well as furniture designers Florence Knoll and George Nelson at firms such as Knoll, Steelcase, and Herman Miller, Michigan all. Michigan is the state that made mid-century modernism. I was just out at the Eames Ranch in Petaluma in Northern California, and we were reflecting on the fact that the Eames got their start here and took to Southern California, to LA and to the Bay Area, the mid-century design culture that had been generated here. So beginning in 1924, when he graduated from the University of Michigan, through the 1970s, J. Robert F. Swanson, Bob Swanson, was a key figure in this tradition. As an undergraduate architecture student at Michigan, Bob Swanson studied with Eliel Saarinen, the resident architect and presiding genius at Cranbrook, who was also a regular guest teacher here. Bob got to know Eliel's daughter, Pipsan, a budding furniture, fashion, and interior designer. The two married in 1926. And Pipsan, along with her father Eliel and her brother Eero Saarinen, played roles in Bob Swanson's firm of Swanson and Booth. Subsequently, both Eliel and Pipsan joined the successor firm of Swanson Associates, with offices in the magnificent Guardian Building, one of downtown Detroit's Art Deco masterpieces that I think some of you will see tomorrow. The firm helped to define Michigan modern and set the parameters for mid-century modernism. After Bob Swanson's death in 1981, his family generously established the J. Robert F. Swanson Fund to support excellence in architecture at the University of Michigan through exhibitions, lectures, and other educational activities. And we're benefiting from that tonight, but also from another Swanson legacy of a different kind. One of two sons, Robert Saarinen Swanson, also known as Bob Swanson, graduated here with a Bachelor of Science in Architecture in 1952. He designed the Art and Architecture building right next door, our main building, which since 1974 has housed Taubman College in its various forms and also houses the Stamp School of Art and Design. We are very lucky to be joined this evening by Bob Swanson, as well as by his daughter, Karen, who is a graduate of the Stamp School and has also taught here at the university. So let's thank them for their family's multi-generational contributions. Thank you. With us tonight is another crowd of Michigan graduates, the Taubman College Alumni Board, Alumni Council. We are glad to have you back. Some of you encountered Alumni Council members yesterday judging the student show, and perhaps you crossed paths with them today during their meeting. And welcome also to the next generation in this tradition, the 100 admitted students or so who have traveled from far and wide to join our preview day. We can't wait to work with you next year. Shohei Shigematsu tonight's speaker, was born in Fukuoka, Japan in 1973. He graduated from the Department of Architecture at Kyushu University, and after studying at the Berlage Institute in Amsterdam, joined the Office for Metropolitan Architecture in 1998. He became an associate of OMA Rotterdam in 2004. 2 years later, he became director of the new OMA AMO New York office. And in 2008, he became a partner in the firm and has led the New York office, which accounts now for about 40% of the firm's activity. He's led that office in the decade since. Sho has led some of the firm's most compelling competitions and projects, including CCTV headquarters in Beijing, Milstein Hall at Cornell, which I like to think of as a descendant of the third floor studio plate that Bob designed for us in the 1970s. And the Prada epicenters, the Shenzhen Stock Exchange, and recently the Faena Arts Center in Miami Beach, as well as high-rise towers around the world. He has also collaborated with great artists, including Cai Guo Qiang, Marina Abramović, and Kanye West. Today, over lunch, Sho sat down with some other deans and the university's campus planning leadership to explore with us some new approaches to our campus development and design. And this evening, he concludes our lecture series by sharing his thoughts on architecture and his work. Welcome, Shohei Shigematsu.
Good evening. Do you hear me well? Okay. It's been 6 years. Last time I gave a lecture here, and it's been changed so much, and it's kind of overwhelming. I don't know what the difference between people who come here and people upstairs. People upstairs want to go back and forth, I guess, non-committed, which understand. Thank you for this honor to have this lecture, and I'm here, and I heard Fujimoto-san, which is my generation, gave a lecture this Monday, so it's kind of a Japan fest. But I have to say that I'm not so happy with the shape that I got in this poster. Look at how Fujimoto and Sir Ajay actually had the amazing kind of shape, and I take this as a kind of implied criticism to OMA, how OMA is becoming not inspirational anymore. Just going back to this school, of course, when I entered, as Jonathan said, in '98, I had the privilege to work with John McMorrow, who is your theoretical premise, intellectual premise here. So it's been 20 years that I entered at your age at OMA and knew nothing about it. And actually, he taught me a lot. So you're very lucky that you have him in this school. Anyway, I owe you the explanation of how OMA is changing, because I think OMA keep evolving as an organization. As you know, there are 3 major offices: Hong Kong, Rotterdam, New York. A lot of people actually think that SML-XL is kind of a must-to-have Bible, but recently I experienced that a lot of students don't even have it or don't even know this book. Is that true? Because some deans, of course, when I give a lecture, they actually give a nice gesture. Oh, who has SML-XL? And then thinking that everyone would have it, but actually only 10% would have it, which I understand because it's already such a long time ago. And it actually, OMA is evolving since. OMA, as you know, established as a collective with Rem and Elia from AA. And then for a long time, when Rem was very prominent, he spawned so many kind of young, successful offices, which eventually became our competitor, really much better offices than us. So what we are doing now is to really have a similar setup, but within the firm, that 9 partners have their own, let's say, studio or projects that are creating kind of multifaceted entity rather than a singular office under a singular brain or singular star architect. So I think this is an experiment, and that's how New York office is operating. So it's in a way a kind of bigger umbrella and under we are in a kind of bigger umbrella, but it's a very young office. So New York office is a diverse range of projects, which I thought it would be important for you to understand our process a little bit, because this is also a great recruiting opportunity. It's a very fun process. I think our architecture really belongs between somewhere general observation of the changes that are happening in the world and actual kind of specific representation of the givens. So in a way, a kind of linear process that we always present from observation, research, clarification, and representation, which is actually never so linear in OMA. The core is still an observation, a cultural observation. But this research, clarification, representation, using different means and different medium is kind of intertwined, and so that you actually go back and forth, you experiment from the observation to narrative, from the model making to diagrams. So it's much more dynamic process. Observation is a thing that I personally think it started, of course, from Venturi and Scott Brown, which, of course, Rem also really admires. I had the privilege to interview them 10 years ago, really asking about the shift from the manifesto model to observation model of architecture. And I think Rem really inherits this take that the architects are now cultural observer that really instigates and communicates the changes to the world. We do a lot of research, but this is like a typical room during a competition. We make a war room, trying to make a narrative. We do a lot of different level of research and create, almost like when you're trying to identify the criminal in a kind of drama, we do this kind of wall. And also, of course, the formal exploration. People tend to think that we are very diagrammatic, but we do a lot of form making, which in a way, of course, really try to extract the beauty that it's unknown beauty, let's say, out of this kind of complex research. Also, the clarification is very important for us. This is, we call it hand job, which is, sorry to mention. So it's something that really communicates a very complex project into a very single gesture using your hand. And I think this is something that is very important for us, that at the end of a very complex process, you can actually explain the project with a very simple means. And also representation itself is also something that we really care. This was a model for Marina Abramović, who is a performance artist. So we made a model that we can actually use the model for her performance and then integrate the model into her performance. We also experiment with media between model making and let's say digital means like this. This was a Lucas Art Museum in Chicago, which in the end was awarded to MAD. And then, as you know, it didn't happen in Chicago. But because it was a museum for George Lucas, we thought we should do a film, which was very, of course, arrogant. Can you make the... So this was a model and then actually kind of overlaid a computer graphics. These are basically, of course, virtual, and this is physical. So we thought it was actually interesting to experiment with our model and computer. To be honest, George Lucas didn't even finish watching this because he was very critical of this kind of movement and angle. So I guess that's one of the reasons why we lost the competition. You know, you get actually quite busy with this thing. Well, the project was such that, as you know, it was planned in a public land. So even before we started the competition, there was opposition. So we thought we should keep the parking lot, which was used for tailgating. So we lifted the entire museum and then made a vertical gallery that really distributes people vertically, but also making a winter garden so that you really even make different types of public space above the gallery. So it wasn't really about his collection and the museum space, but it was a complete gesture for public space. Again, this is a physical model superimposing computer graphics. Of course, these model figures are kind of moving, which is quite cute. So we try to experiment with this mixed media that we always deal with. So let me start with a couple of observations. And this is one of the observations that I would like to start with. It's integration of landscape and architecture. As you know, the High Line attracts more visitors than any other building by now in New York. And you know that the High Line is basically replicated everywhere in the world. This was a quote that triggered me to deal with our version of High Line. This is from Scofidio himself saying High Line was not about architectural statement, but it was about landscaping and preservation of the infrastructure. Of course, there was a reappropriation of infrastructure, existing infrastructure, so it was easy to say this. But because we are in the second wave of High Line effect, we had to deal with a new condition. There was no existing infrastructure, but we had to recreate High Line-like situation. So this was a project in DC connecting Anacostia, which is a predominantly low-income area, to proper DC. So it was a very symbolic gesture to connect those two areas. Typically, the bridge, of course, creates a clearance with a very gentle slope. But we decided to actually make a cross and continue the slope and then create a cross section and then make a symbolic plaza in the center. What it does is that when you come from one side, it creates a gateway into the plaza, and then also you can actually have a program underneath this one of the wing. And then made this a bridge that creates a higher vantage point to view back to the city, both cities, so you can actually go climb higher and then have a view back. This was for us like almost making the L'Enfant's urban grid, urban skewed X into vertical form. So there, as you know, in DC, a lot of X's are skewed, and so many buildings and important plazas are in the center of this X. So it's almost making X into a vertical section and have program around it. So it's more like a Rialto bridge, but a bit more funky shape. And with a capability of having performance or cafe, and also structurally, it kind of makes sense to have these wings. Also trying to show the cleaning of the water of the Anacostia River. So you know, the filtration actually is demonstrated, and we're projecting the kind of storytelling of Anacostia onto the waterfall. This is very close to Pentagon, so when we pitched this, we said, of course, it's visible from Air Force One, from your previous president, not the current, but also, we thought that we could actually have a monument, could be a monument of DC, because there are so many monuments and we had to compete with them. Of course, it's too thin and too not substantial enough to become a monument. But we thought that the shape itself, X means 10, so we thought we could get to a bill and even change the typography. Okay, so we are also dealing with a diversity of activity in the art world, not just museums. As Jonathan explained, we did an atelier for Cai Guo Qiang, the Chinese artist, his atelier in East Village, and also a Japanese tea ceremony room in his. I collaborated with an artist herself, artist Taryn Simon at the Park Avenue Armory. It's called Occupation of Loss. Different mourners from different culture are housed in each tubes, and then as a whole it acts like a concrete pipe organ. Now we are also almost opening in mid-May a new gallery space for Sotheby's. It's an auction house. It's the headquarters of Sotheby's in Upper East in New York, which we're providing 40 different rooms with 20 different typologies, heights, size, and the shape, so that we deliver flexibility through diversity. No longer really trying to actually provide an open-ended a big box, white box, but really trying to define each room and trying to cater their business model, which will open in May. But the biggest project, the substantial project of our art involvement is a museum extension. As you know, museum is doomed to extend, so this was Corbu's idea to permanently extend. But of course, you'll never be able to do that, so there are so many different ways that the old and new actually interact, like autonomous or competitive or seamless like MoMA, or subservient like Guggenheim. No one actually knows that this was an extension. I had the experience to do in early 2001 to do a Whitney, at the time, Whitney Museum of American Art extension next to Breuer. When we came in, there was this kind of infamous extension by Michael Graves that was canceled. So we thought we were in a better position because there was something who failed before. Of course, that sets you up with a success, typically. But the difference was that this brownstone was listed, so we couldn't really demolish. So we decided to launch a building out of a courtyard and then loom over the existing Whitney, providing a very different alternative art spaces compared to a very straightforward gallery space that the Breuer had. But as you know, that also went into history, same as the Graves, kind of infamous example. And Renzo Piano took over, and even he couldn't really finish in Upper East, as you know. That's why he went to downtown. There is a conspiracy theory that OMA and Renzo Piano is the same office, actually, because we always start and he takes over. So now, after 20 years, we're now finally getting some museum projects. This is Albright Knox extension. This is in Buffalo in the Delaware Park, Olmsted Design Park, and the 60s extension by Gordon Bunshaft with a courtyard here. But we are adding a new wing here in the north that really, I don't get into the detail, but embraces the park as a kind of 360 view and a gallery space inside. So this is a kind of promenade we call. It's a flexible space where you can have sculpture or events. We are also doing a new museum. We just won a new museum extension next to Sana, which is, of course, a very interesting extension because it has been only 10 years since the first one was built. So extension typically happens in the timeline of 30, 40 years. Now we are doing after 10 years. New museum is becoming a very diverse activity, multifaceted art entity, not just a museum. The site is here. Site is linear and longer, but the brief was to really clone the existing program, so almost making another new museum next to it, which I cannot really show you. I picked this last day of when Jonathan asked, thinking that I could show this project, but because of many reasons, it's still not public. It will be public somewhere in the summer, so I really cannot show you, I'm sorry. But I can show you how we thought. So we thought because this one is new, it cannot be a typical relationship of new and old, or because it's such an urban vertical site, it cannot be like a pavilion or wing. So we thought we could have a very interesting relationship. So we collected the images that represents maybe a potential tension or interesting relationship of the two even before we started designing. For example, this one or this one with Marina and her husband, or this one, one is vertical and one is horizontal but well balanced. I cannot show you the design, but please remember these three images. When the image get released, then you will understand our design. Quebec is extension of a museum too, which we finished. It's in Quebec City. It was in a battlefield park where French and English fought. Existing museum was always in the park. They bought the site next to a church facing the main boulevard of the city. So the first time that the museum will get the address to the city. So in order to actually address that ambition, we thought that not only art extends, but both park and the city. So three entities simultaneously extends. So not just art, but park, city both extends, and art becoming the catalyst between the city and the park. So you can see that the landscape continues up, stack of three galleries connected to a church. The church is going to be part of the museum. And actually, it's connected by the tunnel to a former prison. So it was a kind of dream job that, as an architect, to design a building that is simultaneously connected to both church and prison. So this is the museum. It's a very straightforward box. You can see it's connected to a church, creating a new grand entrance. This was at the opening day, just showing off the Justin's shaking hands. And this grand hall actually becomes a kind of extension of a street. What's notable here is that the museum business in Canada is slightly different from US, which is not funded solely by private funds. So they have to make their own revenue stream or half of their budget. So we designed this whole entry hall as an event space, column-free event space, so they can actually do an event and raise money. So it's more like art on top of an event space. So you will see there's a courtyard, there's a shop, there's a cafe, and there's an atrium, and there's a temporary gallery space. So this is a grand hall that has a park and the history, the park side. This is a church side that we abstracted. And this is how it's working now. It's full of people. It's really acting like a public plaza. Also nightlife. They do art installations, theater, lectures, again event, again a club. Also in places not just on the ground level, but throughout the building they do this kind of events, lots of parties and concerts. Those spaces are intertwined with a vertical circulation, such as this one, a stair that really creates a kind of a spiral of people coming from the tunnel and people coming from the street. And this is the opening day. And this is how it's used. This is an interesting one. I don't know why there's a barber inserted in the museum here, but always it's interesting to actually monitor through Instagram how the buildings are used. So we are actually very grateful to Instagram that we can actually monitor the post-occupancy of the building. This is the tunnel that I said it's connecting to a former prison. It's also used as a gallery. There are a lot of windows that frames the view out. And we call this a stair window, which sticks out of the building and really be immersed in the park while you're going up, and you can actually expose the people's movement from outside. The glass is triple glazing with the textured glass, fritted glass, and vision glass. So it has this kind of depth, and it has this kind of, captures the light in a kind of dramatic way, but also it acts quite kind of icy in the winter, which is quite important in Quebec, which has almost half a year there's a snow. And the facade changes throughout the time like this. And because the building is used as an event space, also it's translucent, it actually represents those activities at night. Through doing this, I did a studio at Columbia called Perineology because I was a bit interested in how the art world is changing from the Bilbao effect when I entered OMA, which was the height of Bilbao effect, which was really generating this iconic structure, museums. But now my hypothesis is that that's changing to an art event. This is the amount of biennials that exist in the world, 196. That means this is a 2017, let's say take a September, there's 19 biennials happening at the same time in the world. That means this is becoming almost like a kind of checklist of the municipalities, similar to the moment that Bilbao was going to be the checklist. The amount of visitors of art fairs are outnumbering the museums now. So this is my theory, that in the mid-90s to early 2000s, the money was spent to iconic, very expensive buildings, museums, but now a lot of municipalities are having art events with a tent, which is actually a very dramatic change for an architect, because we could be the star architect building this, but now no one cares about this anymore, but cares about the tent and the experience. Also, the scale of those art event spaces are scaling the biggest museum in the world. So, but of course, the experience within those art events and art fairs are very homogeneous because no architects are involved. So I'm really promoting that we should be more involved. We could be involved a little bit in Miami Beach, which is, as you know, the only location that Art Basel happens in US. We were given 3 sites next to a hotel that the Argentinian developer was developing. In the end, we convinced him that it should not be just a ballroom for the hotel, but it should act like a cultural anchor that really embraces the need of art events that is happening in Miami Beach. So we basically made a ballroom into something a bit more cultural. So in the end, because of the urbanistic reason, we wanted to claim the center of the compound. We made a kind of circular cylinder shape, and then a black box behind it. So it looks like 2 buildings attached into a single building, like this. That has a distinct shape in plan. One is cylinder, one is circle, and one is square. And also in section, one is a dome, and one is a black box. And this is the dome side. This is you're looking at the black box side. And then there's a circulation along the perimeter. You can use it simultaneously as one. You can use it as one space, or you can use 2 event spaces simultaneously by closing the threshold. So now they are using it quite well with different events related to art or lectures. This is the black box side, which has a backdrop to the creek, big window, also used as an event space. This is a 3rd space, which is the entry foyer, which we made a kind of amphitheater that is also used as a small concert or a lecture or event space. So you can actually have 3 simultaneous events in this building. So it's a machine for the events. Landscape slides down and create this kind of moment where you can actually have also events and also becomes a kind of canopy for welcoming people. In order to achieve this cantilever, we mobilized a skin as a tube structure, which we used in the end, this kind of more of organic arches and catenary curve to really suspend the cantilever, superimposed with the hurricane grid, which is required in Miami. So these 2 patterns creates this pattern, and it's all structural, so there is no internal column, which creates more than 200 different types of windows, which was cast like this, and then eventually made the shape of the windows. As you can see, it really is very close to the beach, so it really looks like a seashell or almost like a kind of organic form next to a beach. in the inauguration of the building, the client was always kind of being melancholic about, oh, we used to be able to see this pattern from the inside, but of course, in order to use it as an event space, we had to make an internal wall. So the client thought it was really pity. So in the opening day, we decided to do a scenography for dance that really calculates the sun path of that opening day as if there was no internal wall, how the shadow would have cast into interior. So this is a kind of calculation of how the shadow was casting if there was no internal wall. And then basically we project mapped that sun, the shadow, and then basically projected with the movement of people. There's a sound here, but anyway, so good. Even the religious entity now wants event space. This is the one in LA, a Wilshire Boulevard Temple. So it's Wilshire Drive. It's one of the most prominent synagogue in LA. This is in Koreatown. And this is at the juncture of residential and more civic zone. This is a compound that they own, and our site was next to the synagogue on the parking lot. So, of course, it was next to a very iconic temple, so we were, of course, thinking how to do it. This was a kind of given box by the client, with the event space and some office space. We decided to actually embrace the kind of LA architecture, which we always observe it as a very basic and almost laconic architecture, but maybe by giving a respect to historical structure, it could be exciting. So we actually did two manipulations. One is to really sway away from the temple. And also there is a historic school that was here, also swayed away and then reflected that movement towards the Wilshire Drive. Only two manipulations. So it's a very strange shape. It looks like a box, but it's actually skewed. And this is the event space, the gathering space. In order to have some resonance of the existing building, we made this kind of vaulted space on the ground as a thoroughfare event space that connects Wilshire Drive to the courtyard of historical school. So there's some kind of resonance of the dome. So this is the historical courtyard of the school. And this is a multifunctional event space. This is event space, and this is Wilshire. So people, after the religious event, they come from here and then basically use event space. Event space is also surrounded by a different program. So it's almost like an opera house, but it's turned to have a vantage point from above looking down into the event space. Also, there's another second space that frames the stained glass of the window, which is a chapel space, creates a half inside, half outside to really embrace the climate of LA. It's a chapel space here, really facing the church, the synagogue. And then in the end, also the roof is also an event space. Again, really people nowadays wants to meet and do events. So every single space is considered as a potential event space, having a great view to LA. And there's an amphitheater, or there's a courtyard here. And ultimately, those three major voids are interconnected. So you have an unexpected view from one to the other. So from the vaulted space, you can actually see the dome. From this exterior space chapel, you can actually see the roof. And from roof, you can actually see all the way down. It's a kind of typical OMA kind of complexity. This is the how we consider the facade. The dome was consisting of different hexagons, so we use a hexagonal plate, one unit, hexagon and a rectangular window, and then we rotated them according to the program behind, offices being straight, circulation and some other functions can be a bit more playful. So that creates this kind of pattern. This is a mock-up recently, so it creates this kind of texture into a kind of rather basic shape. It's under construction, so it's going to be the first cultural building in LA for OMA. This is another observation I've been thinking, and I did a studio called Alimentary Design at GST. The thinking was that, you know, within the three fundamentals of human being, clothing, shelter, food, architecture and clothing became instantly globalized and losing its locality. But food actually is the only entity in here that can preserve both extreme locality and also a global position. So I thought that maybe architecture can learn from the food industry. Food is quite diverse, as you know, like there's a terroir culture that, you know, champagne can only be called champagne if it's from a Champagne region, but it could also be global. So I think that's a kind of interesting model for architecture too. So I wanted to look at architecture and urban design through the lens of food. Food is the biggest industry in the world. Food used to be a currency itself. This is the salt bar, which was used as a currency in the ancient time. First globalization and expedition happened through the food, searching for food. Food industry is multi-process, so it actually has a lot of surface area to deal with to architecture because it's urban scale and also in a domestic scale. Frank Lloyd Wright actually did a Broadacre house that promotes a certain amount of agricultural land owned by each residence and basically planned the city for that, which is, I thought the current city is, of course, pushing a lot of food industry, food production into outskirts. So there's no basically interface between food and city living. But he, for example, made this plan, and which is actually quite remarkable how you can see like this kind of electric car looking thing, and then also drone and the high-rise and agricultural land, which I thought it was very, it's in 58, which was very futuristic and actually in a way for me really showing a potential new model for next generation. This was his model of Broadacre City. But what's happening in China is actually quite similar. This is the actual picture. Because the expansion of the city and agricultural need, of course, this hybridization is happening by default. Look at this. I think it's actually quite striking how the food production and the city is kind of intertwined. And I'm not saying this is the only model, but I thought this was an interesting way to look at the new city. Also, China is planning a city that's dedicated to food production. In 2011, the consumption of fish was more than beef for the first time. That means the ocean becomes the also a domain for food production. This is the city of Hainan. Of course, the fishermen actually live on the water, and a lot of architects actually projected living on the water, like Kenzo Tange, recently other architects, but it was never about food production. But I think if it was this kind of floating city is connected to food production, I think it could have been more convincing. Food is also related to mobility. This is the first McDonald's store, which was a car hopping place, so it was highly related to the mobility. Also, as you know, supermarket was related to the invention of cars and the big trunk that you can actually bring a week amount of food back home. We used to drive to food, like this interesting architecture, but now, as you know, food actually comes to you. So the kind of mobility and how food actually moves in the city is also changing. And also, not to mention, one of the biggest investment going to startups are food-related startups. And it's also quite apparent that Amazon, who started distributing books, now distributes food. Uber started distributing people, now also distributes food. So I think the movement of food is also changing in urban environment. Also, canteen, which is a social kind of model of collective eating. But now it's deployed into most capitalistic environments, such as the tech companies' canteen. Kitchen used to be a very subservient room in ancient times, but now kitchen is a kind of social hub in the living room. Hence, it actually evolves into a kind of different ways. This is a kitchen that could be used as a counter, so it slides, and then it could be a kitchen, but it doesn't need to be. When it slides back, it just becomes a counter. There are many inventions of automated kitchens. This is an interesting one from Electrolux, a Swedish company called Global Chef. Their kind of pitch is that this is a holographic projection of either a famous chef or your family members to teach you the recipe. But this guy doesn't really look neither like a chef nor your family member. So you can see already a kind of ambition to connect to kind of Tinder or something. The food itself could be printed. So this is a 3D food printer. It looks quite disgusting, but that means, yeah. This apparently was trying to make a kind of alto bass, but now we have to come in and design for them. Otherwise, this kind of thing will continue. Of course, this was a big hit, also bringing back a market into a city life and then framing with residential. Everyone thought this was not a great idea, but it's one of the most successful hybrid typology in this decade. So this was a studio, and I did the whole research for 3 years, and now out of that, for example, in West Louisville, we are doing a community center called Food Hub, which is to kind of community center / having processing and distribution capability for local farmers. One of the issue of the current kind of hype of local food movement is that it always ends up with a kind of farmer's market, but farmer's market is in the end a business to consumer model that the local farmers don't get so much benefit because the time commitment is too big to just gain selling a couple of jams in the weekend. But the biggest effect will come when the local food becomes business to business, such as local hospitals, schools, and airlines. They really want the local food. But the local farmers don't have a big enough facility to actually distribute to such a large amount. So this building was trying to have a shared facility so that the local farmers can actually use to distribute to a larger consumers. So basically a business-to-business model. I'm also interested in fashion a lot, and I did a lot of fashion exhibitions. I want to show you one, which was in Met in 2016, which was called Manus Ex Machina. It was trying to show how the man-made and machine-made, which was always associated with haute couture, was man-made, machine-made was ready-to-made, but that boundary was being blurred. Typically, the fashion exhibition has a kind of singular theme or singular era, singular designer. There's a coherence to it, but this exhibition was all about the difference and comparing the differences. So I thought we had to really make an exhibition that people can really focus on the details, which happened in the Lehman Wing, which is at the very west side of the Met that sticks out to the park, which is in the central axis of the Met at the very end. Not so many people know that it even exists, which is an atrium space in the hallway, and basically it's not a pure gallery space. So this was the first time that this exhibition was given to this kind of atrium, not the gallery space, which in the end benefited us. As you know, Met has a lot of classical language, and even before we get to a Lehman Wing, there's this kind of medieval court that has a more religious classical language. So this was a plan. We were assigned this red area, which is basically a hallway and the atrium. What we did was to really create a new building inside a building, almost mimicking the section of a cathedral, which we call it a ghost cathedral, because this section actually had the property of like that. But also, as I said, right next to this Lehman wing, there was this classical medieval gallery. So what we did was that there was a necessity to black out this atrium, so we basically made a whole new envelope inside. And then created a plan that uses the new building and the in-between space and the new and the old are actually assigned as a pochets to exhibit these different garments. And then we use this scrim material, which is basically a fabric with punched holes that we use as a kind of infrastructure to also have a text and also have a projection and also be the backdrop of all the garments. We also added a new floor to the atrium because there was no floor on the ground level, so we added a floor. So this was before, this was after. This was a Chanel dress by Lagerfeld that we projected the pattern to the dome, which was in the end a blackout dome, but we used it as almost like a Sistine Chapel kind of a projection of the pattern, and this was a pochet. We used a very rough scaffolding as an armature and then just basically put the fabric on top of it. So there's a juxtaposition of very rough New York daily kind of material and a very refined scrim, which is a very interesting property because if you project if you have a light from front, it becomes very opaque, but if you have a light from behind, it becomes very transparent. So you can see the complexity of the translucency before, after. One of the critique of mine to the recent fashion exhibition was that it relies too much on media, like showing flat screens everywhere and showing the kind of the catwalk pictures, the videos, which I thought it really distracts your concentration to confront the garments itself. So we decided not to have any screen, but whenever there's a media, it's integrated to architecture. And the content is all about the garments. So this is a pochet that we project mapped, and it's only showing the detail of the garments, and it's always integrated to architecture. So I will finish in 5 minutes. As you know, this comes with a gala, a famous gala. This is me presenting, and it's not going well, as you can see. To Anna Winter, we had to design the gala design also. She eventually took her sunglasses off, just to tell you. So every gala, the designer has to design a kind of centerpiece. So we designed this. One is a kind of man-made cut flowers, and the other one is actual petals of flowers. But in the end, of course, the production company couldn't really realize as we sketched, so it became a little bit dumb. But what we also proposed was that this actually connects to the red carpet that really climbs up to this desk, which we thought it will never happen, but somehow by default, mistake or something. It actually happened. So this spiral actually became the red carpet. This is me entering with Taylor Swift and being seized not to climb up until she actually finishes her photo session. But anyway, this was heavily criticized as a red carpet that is distracting because you have 3 colors, typically one color. But I have a different opinion because of this kind of spiral shape, the shape, it created this kind of circle in the center, the white area, but somehow people naturally stood there for a photo shoot. So this one is perfect, fitting to the circle. And this one. So I have a different opinion about the success. So now I end with my kind of favorite topic about the mixed use. As architect, nowadays, my hypothesis is that the mixed use buildings becoming the kind of generic. So whatever you're going to be designing, it's going to be mixed use. Rem was the one of the first one to say that the potential of mixed use by Downtown Athletic Club, as you might know from the Delirious New York, saying that, of course, the high-rise allows you to have different programs stacked. This is the model of the Copenhagen's land value model, which actually shows, of course, the land values goes higher, you have to start mixing. This is, for me, also showing how mixed use has to happen because the density in the city center where the land prices are higher, you have to start stacking different programs. So this is a city of Tokyo, big enough to have different atmosphere, different areas represented here by different colors. If you compare that to a dinner table, it's almost like an a la carte style, sharing different dishes, different ingredients, different dishes, and have different conversations. But now there are different mixed-use buildings that are huge and really kind of having a similar program, almost identical program. This is in Tokyo, office, museum, hotel, you name it, you know it, which we call it a bento box instead of a la carte style, which really prepackages the program into a container. So what used to be very kind of dynamic as a dinner table, sharing and kind of passing the different dishes, is becoming kind of predictable, like people eating your own bento box. Which, of course, I love bento box and I still eat them a lot, but I'm just saying that if this becomes the only experience in the city, it's of course a big problem. Because we as an architect being asked to distinguish a building from one to the other, but if the program itself is inherently the same, of course the inherent experience will be the same. So we as an architect need to also able to promote, propose programmatic ideas, not just architectural ideas. So we are doing that in like Santa Monica. I skipped this, but now I want to end with a high-rise in Tokyo, which is for Mori building, which I showed you as a bad example. I actually showed that to the client and got this project. So this is in Toranomon, which is close to the new Olympic. Olympic is happening next year in Tokyo. And then this is the old zone, this is the new zone, this is somewhere in the junction. It's at the boulevard of it's at the new axis of Olympics that the Tokyo is planning, and our building is behind this existing building. It's this one, which I thought is an interesting site because in Tokyo there is not so many axial quality. As you know, it's very organic. So this is one of the rare moments that there is an axis. So, but our site was hidden because it's right on the axis, actually. So I decided to continue the activity of the boulevard that ends at the plinth of this existing building, but continue that activity to the bridge, through the bridge onto our site. Because Mori building used to be building a freestanding tower, but now they build so much in Tokyo that my basically proposal was to tell them that you have to now think of a network between the high-rise, not just about the freestanding high-rise. So this was our building, but we said, why don't you give some kind of public thoroughfare in the center so that the base become highly connected and highly public, and creating this kind of walkable loop between different high rises that they have. And not only that, we extended a special program into the center of the tower so that this axis will be visible from everywhere in Tokyo. In order to achieve that, we actually moved the central core to a side core so that the center of the tower is given to a public, which was a very important gesture for us because, of course, the high-rise, you tend to have a core in the center, and the center is always occupied by the building users, but here the center is occupied by the public. So there's a bridge that connects, so this is the tower, Tokyo Tower, the bay. So you can see the bridge is actually going into the tower, and the shape is such that one side is trapezoidal, like a pyramid shape, like this, and the other side is basically the opposite shape, but upside down, so that there is a kind of lofting between these two shapes that creates a three-dimensional axial center here. So this is the bridge, and the bridge actually penetrates right in the middle of the development and then goes through it. And it's also connected to a larger network because it's above the new metro station. Also, this is how it's going through, and this is the public datum, which is a bridge, but also in underground it's connected to a new metro station. So there will be a big concourse that is connected to a metro station. So this is the underside of the bridge. So you have a pedestrian network at the second level and the underground network that is connected to a larger metro system. As I was saying about the bento box part, we propose to have a multi-functional media art space because they already have a museum in Roppongi Hills, but they want something, they are now promoting this more business and technology domain as their kind of tenants. So we wanted to symbolically make a kind of event space up in the top, which was proposed not in a competition brief, but we proposed and they agreed to do it. So we are now doing it with a kind of infinity pool, kind of trying to have some moment of like a Singapore-like moment, which the weather is completely different, but you have a great view to the Imperial Palace. And this is the axis, and this is a new building. Thank you so much. Sorry, I talked too long. Any questions?
Well, welcome to Taubman. This was a great presentation. I know that a lot of offices similar to OMA do some very deep research, and I know that you have activities in the on the academia side. So I'm wondering, would you say
what
that
side?
On the academia side, you said you have a studio that you teach in different schools. So I'm wondering how much of the process is focused on research and how much of it is focused on production. Would you say that there is more focus on research, or is it kind of a half and half?
I think the word research is being misused or overused in some offices or some cases. What I was trying to say here is the observation is more of a spontaneous drive. It's not about related to a project. Of course, every project, every architect do some level of research. But the research is a bit of a word that is easily used. I sometimes hesitate to use word research in front of the people who are actually really researching in academic field. So in our research is more like a justification of what we are doing and also trying to create a narrative and trying to convince the client or the larger audience. But what I wanted to say about the importance of observation, which I think REM is very good at also, is not related to any kind of architectural outcome. It's about your spontaneous drive to understand the changes that are happening in the world. And I think, of course, you can call that research, but for me, that's also not really a research. I think the smoke screen of the word research, as you said, I don't know which office is actually doing a fundamental research, because that's why I think we use academic environment to really actually dive into a topic that we are interested in that doesn't necessarily come out as any benefit to the office. But we still like, we promote this kind of observation and the research at the office. We try not to design too much before we understand the conditions. But I wouldn't call that as a pure research. It's a kind of, I don't know what the word, please invent. You're gonna throw that? Yeah.
No.
It's a great system.
Hi, thank you very much for your speech today. I think my question is that, did it ever happen to you when you feel uncomfortable with the shape or the forms you came up? Did you try exploring other shapes, or just let the rational reasons?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, because that part is often misunderstood of our work, that our form is always very rational and very diagrammatic, which I personally think is not true. We embrace the uncomfortability. Actually, we often tell at the studio that something that's seemingly ugly has a more potential than seemingly very resolved, because something that younger generation makes as a study, often they don't think so, but they're often influenced by architecture blogs or the forms that they have seen somewhere in the internet, and tend to be very, fashionable, or so we actually really try to embrace the ugliness as a part of the beauty. And also, if we don't come up with a beautiful form out of the research and narrative we did, we often go back to the research to really rethink the premise to conceive something better. Because I think if the narrative and the form, if the narrative cannot generate an interesting form, we actually re-question the narrative itself. So there's this back and forth, as I explained in the beginning. So please, if you conceive something ugly, just celebrate yourself.
Thank you.
What do I do with this? Can you comment on whether your designs use more glass or less glass than other architectural designs? And then maybe on the future, whether it glass up or glass down.
Glass as in glazing, like the glass envelope? Yeah.
As a tool of architect, I think.
You mean glass as a glass facade? Yeah? I'm experiencing more and more comments from a lot of the institutions about transparency, which of course, sometimes it's a lip service, but like a museum, which is a gallery space, of course tend to become closed by nature. Also, event space needs to be closed by nature, by use. That's why we're trying to introduce different tactics, different ways to actually have a sense of openness, which in the Albright Knox case, which I didn't really explain, 1 second please, there are There is an internal gallery tower, which is efficient gallery box. But because it's in the park, we basically made another glass enclosure so that you can actually even use the outside of the gallery box. You know, typically the gallery wall is the interface to the outside, which tends to be closed as a museum. But by enveloping the outside and creating this promenade space, you can actually use the outer side of the gallery also as a domain for art, and then create this kind of promenade around it. And this, of course, inside is opaque here, but it promotes the transparency. But of course, this is just a kind of design, and I think the glass is being used more and more, to be honest. But there are two things that are going against the glass, usage of the glass, which is the environmental performance aspect of the buildings are now becoming more and more strict. So it's becoming almost impossible to do a glass tower in the urban environment. So there will be different tricks to actually achieve the sustainability goal with the glass. So that's another challenge. And I think glass itself, I don't think has been evolved so much about the resistance to fire, etc., which always is an issue. The cost is an issue. So I'm always so annoyed by the glass whenever we have to pick one. But yeah, it's still a very predominant, prominent material.
All right. Thank you very much for your very insightful and entertaining lecture. I really enjoyed. So I'm currently in a thesis architecture that focuses on virtual reality. So my question is how OMA is deploying virtual reality technologies. And maybe the second part of the question is how you envision the role that virtual reality is playing or will be playing in architectural design. Thank you.
We use, now we actually create the VR as a part of our presentation to the client. So actually it's quite effective to be able to use it. But the virtual reality itself is still part of the representation and kind of experience, not really using it as a design tool. So I guess your research goes beyond the representation. Which I would love to know more, but currently we are still very low tech in that, or not so creative in using it. So
thank you.
It would be great if you could teach us.
So earlier in your lecture, you talked about how buildings all over the world are starting to look the same because of the function that they were being asked. Mm-hmm. And it seemed like your solution was that as an architect, it's our role to try to change the function of the building. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that and what that means.
I skipped that part, so I guess it was difficult to understand. But one way to deal with that kind of change is that the bento box thing is that as I started by Rem was trying to put, until now mixed use was trying to put the different program into single shape, single container, which always creates some level of inefficiency in some program because the shape is not suitable for every program. But here we're trying to do the reverse because we like the idea that mixed use is almost like a conglomeration or a cluster of different buildings. So here, this is a Santa Monica building that has hotel, residential, office, and retail that has an ideal dimension and ideal volumetric shape for each program first. And then we stack them on top of each other to create something unknown. So rather than trying to conceive a single shape and then stack them, we're trying to do something like that, that each program has high level of efficiency, but as a whole become kind of iconic and also providing different public spaces because different program always have a different size and different shape, which always creates this kind of terrace. And the other message was that, like in the Mori's case, really try to also propose a program, not just a building form, to the developers, so that you are part of the kind of discussion of how you can actually truly distinguish your building to the others, not just making a kind of cooler facade compared to the others. So two sides to it.
Gotcha. Thank you.
You're supposed to throw it.
So I'm curious about how, I know you have been in OMA for a very long time, and how do you see, like, is there a change, shift in direction or some sort of evolution in this firm? Yeah.
What do you think?
I don't know.
Okay. I think I wouldn't call it evolution. I think we're ad hocly changing our structure to sustain the life of the firm beyond REM's presence. But I think in a way the current structure is interesting, that there's autonomy, sense of autonomy, but sense of collectivity too. So let's see if this, every great kind of organization actually diminishes, personal, let's say, promotion. But we are highly promoting both organization and partners. So I don't know how that will end up. Currently, I think it just started, but it's interesting and working. But I wouldn't call that evolution, but it's just an experiment, or it's just a kind of consequence of this moment.
Thank you.
But it's interesting, so I highly recommend it as a place to work.
Hi. So my question is, for example, your last Highrise, you move the core to the side, and then the core is for the other uses. So this kind of movement will higher the risk of the rent, higher the risk of the construction. So how do you convince the clients to do this kind of a risky move? Or do you say the client is better when they choose OMA, or do you say you're more convincing to this kind of risky movements? Thank you.
I think the notion of the risk is changing in a development world. Also, as a mature company like the Mori Building, I think they have, in a way, being somewhat conservative, or they are simultaneously very conservative, so they also can experiment. And the younger generation, one thing that is, it's a kind of worth mentioning is that I'm 45 years old, but now a lot of leaders are becoming younger and younger, and I think there are decision makers are becoming a little bit similar age, in Asia especially. And I think that actually is a very crucial fact, that something like this can be pulled off at my age, because before in Japan it was much more conservative, and I think people couldn't even think of actually hiring someone like us. But now I think it's changing. But I think this, of course, the public aura is, in the end, contributes to their sales and business. So it's the right balance of, I presented, of course, only about this public space, but actually the efficiency of the office and efficiency of the core is also really kind of presented as something very convincing. So, of course, it has to do both, and I wish maybe I should have presented that side too, but it's not only this I presented, but also high efficiency of the office level. So you have to touch, check both sides. Great.
So I'm quite curious about your opinions about the relationship between nature and architecture in OMA's projects. Because in Fujimoto's speech, he's always like considering about how to introduce nature into his project and also how to like use those things, structures to blur the boundary between these two things. But OMA's project seems to be more powerful to the context. So what's your general idea about? Yeah.
He's a friend of mine, and I think there are a couple of things I want to say about that generation of Japanese architects. They're all coming from a similar school, like Toyo Ito, Sejima, which people tend to think that's a kind of dominant group in Japanese architecture, but it's not. Please don't misunderstand. 90% is built by general contractor, big firms. It's actually even like Sejima, Toyo Ito cannot get public works in Japan. That's why they're building outside. A lot of people ask me, oh, in Japan there are great houses. Great houses are designed. That's a sign that even talented young architects don't get any opportunity to do public buildings. That's why they have to do small houses. So please don't misread the context of Japanese kind of media bombardment. And also how Fujimoto-san is saying nature and architecture, also Ishigami-san is saying, that's a kind of, for me, just a kind of trying to find a language that is quite abstract and something that goes against modernism, which I kind of respect. I think Japanese young architects are seriously looking for what's after modernism. And I think that's a respective kind of mentality, but I don't know if it's truly looking for it. I mean, if he has to do high-rise at the end, I don't know what kind of nature he's gonna bring in, So sometimes it's this a kind of a rhetorical thing. So, I mean, do you really, they're convincing and they're the beautiful things, but there are other, contexts that drives them to say that. So, yeah, it's not a criticism to him. This is recorded, right? But
Thanks.
I always tell them, so it's fine.
Hi, I just have a very little question about like you talk about the Instagram things.
Very little question.
Yeah, just about those social medias.
Okay.
Like in OMA's website, like the social media plays a very important role. Like your every project have a very big part to show the updates on the social media. And how do you think about this part, like the social media will play or right now plays in both architecture education and architectural practice?
Yeah, our website is very confusing, right? Sometimes. You're searching for a project and click and then you go to someone's Instagram, which I think it's an interesting way to intertwine whatever our message is and whatever our consumed message of ours is. As to treat them almost equally is interesting way to embrace the culture of social media. But ultimately, I don't know architecture. Architecture is maybe becoming more and more about the spectacle and the kind of radicality through the architecture blogs and social media. I don't know if that's a kind of great direction, but of course there are like fundamentalists also that goes against them. So I guess in the end, for me, it's just a part of the, part of the culture that our age has to deal with, but not only culture that we have to deal with. There are many other things that we have to embrace. So for me, it's one of them. It's not about a dominant feature of life.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much.